Thank you. Good evening. Let me first start by thanking you all for being here. This is a great turnout, and I think exactly what our professor deserves for tonight. But it's an honor to be here with you as the WVU community gathers to hear from our esteemed professor and mentor to many, many students over the years as he shares some of his wisdom with us. His former students, many of whom I see are in the audience tonight, will tell you we're in for a treat. For the past 40 years, Dr. DiClerico has meant so much to so many students. He has opened the minds of his students to the inner workings of our government and established a national reputation for his expertise on the American presidency while helping dozens of WVU students earn prestigious scholarships from the Rhodes to the Truman. For decades, new WVU students entering his American government course got their first look at what higher learning really means. In all of his classes, he motivates students to learn and challenges them every single step of the way. From what I have heard, and I've heard this from a lot of people, his classes are really tough, really, really tough, but taught in a way that inspires his students to reach those standards, the very high standards. From his current students to his former students and from his colleagues, he is viewed as truly one of the most revered professors in the history of our great university. All of us will miss his full-time presence on our campus, but we are thrilled that he will still be teaching a few classes. We know that his legacy will long endure in the proud Rhodes and Truman Scholar tradition he helped WVU to build and in the mind of every student that he inspired. It's actually really fitting that tonight he will share his final lecture with all of us tonight through the David C. Hardesty Jr. Festival of Ideas. And I'm also really pleased, and I know they were already recognized, but I do want to point out my friend and mentor, former WVU President David Hardesty and his wife Susan. I really appreciate all you've done for this university and all you continue to do. So one more time, let us thank you. Personal view, you know, I always thought the greatest honor in the world was being called a university professor. I thought there was nothing better than that title or what that really meant. And for those of us who have had the honor to serve in that capacity, and for those of us that are currently serving as a faculty member, you know, it really all comes down to making a difference. You know, making the world a better place, educating the next generation of scholars, and no one has done that better than our speaker tonight. You know, I hear the name, when I ask our alums, you know, who has had the greatest influence on them, who has had the greatest impact, the name that I hear over and over and over again, regardless of their major, is Dr. DiClerico. Without question, the name I hear the most. Just last night, we were in this room as we introduced the 20 newest Bucklew scholars at a dinner right here. One of our current foundation scholars who spoke at the event pointed him out as the professor who pushed him the hardest, who taught him the most, and he said that his classes were the highlight of his college experience. He said that the professor's classes were very, very rigorous and very time-consuming, but worth every single minute of it. So when it really comes down to making a difference in someone's life, to helping others achieve their dreams, and to helping others achieve their full potential, no one really does it better than the one that you will hear from tonight. So for that, I simply say, Professor, thank you for a job very, very well done. Thank you for opening the minds of our students, and thank you for being a role model that the rest of us in higher ed should emulate. So, Professor, I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight to hear your lecture. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage our newest Truman Scholar, Mr. Ben Seaball. Ben?
Good evening. It is such a pleasure to be here before you all tonight to introduce our keynote speaker. I am so humbled, in fact, I must admit I have never written a statement so many times as this one. I'm honored with the dual purpose of giving a suitable introduction for the man of the hour while trying to accurately relate the things that have made him so great. As many of us did, I learned about Dr. DiClerico's reputation long before I first saw him. As a rising freshman political science major, I heard of Dr. DiClerico from many other political science students who were already studying at WVU. What was intriguing, though, was when I heard about Dr. DiClerico from a WVU alumnus who had graduated in the late 1970s, and who still remembered Dr. DiClerico quite well. Yes, his reputation precedes him to this day. Dr. DiClerico is the quintessential college professor. His signature bow tie, his tortoiseshell glasses, his pensive tobacco pipe, and his fast-paced lectures are the stuff of legend. In the classroom, Dr. DiClerico never wasted a moment. From the instant he walks into the lecture hall, his outline is immediately written on the board, and his lecture always begins on time. He never takes a moment to review his lecture notes. The lecture flows from him as if it were pre-recorded. But more than these things, perhaps that which defines Dr. DiClerico the most is the unwavering respect with which he treats all of his colleagues and students, unless, of course, he catches a student reading the newspaper during lecture. He is known for referring to all of his students as doctor, a puzzling yet endearing display of humility, and for personally congratulating any students in his class who have persevered enough to receive an A on one of his notoriously challenging exams. During his time here at WVU, Dr. DiClerico has taught more than 26,000 students. It has been said that Dr. DiClerico does not teach you, he enlightens you. One friend of Dr. DiClerico went on to note that DiClerico provides leadership and mentorship simply by asking questions. With the simplest inquiry, he can make you ponder for days. Originally from Massachusetts, Dr. DiClerico completed his undergraduate studies in New York, received his PhD in Indiana, and finally landed here at WVU 40 years ago. While many have questioned why he chose WVU in the first place and why he chose to stay here, there is no question that we are grateful that he did. He has not only been a fantastic professor, but an incredibly generous advisor. Over the past 40 years, he has spent countless tireless hours serving as both the Rhodes Scholarship Institutional Representative and the Truman Scholarship Faculty Representative, passing through 6 Rhodes Scholars and 21 Trumans. Due entirely to his diligence, WVU has been named a Truman Honor Institution, which places us among the most elite universities nationwide for sustained success in helping students achieve Truman scholarships. I must say, as this year's Truman nominee from WVU, I had the honor to meet with DiClerico on a weekly basis, if not more, over the past several months. And I can personally vouch that he invests an incredible amount of time in preparing the Truman applicants over a span of several months. He takes time to meet with applicants, review dozens of drafts of applications, coordinate interviews, and provide his invaluable guidance and experience. As some of you may know, over the last several years, the Truman has gone to many students in departments other than political science. Well, the pressure was on doubly this year. First of all, Dr. DiClerico made it quite clear that it was time to bring the Truman back to the political science department. But he also hinted that this may be his last year to achieve that goal. And even now that he is retiring, he is not slowing down. He will still be teaching classes in the fall, and he will still be serving as a mentor to his successor as the Truman Faculty Representative. In giving introductions, I know that it's also common practice to note some of the most prestigious awards that the keynote speaker has received. But in the interest of leaving time in the program for Dr. DiClerico to actually give his lecture, I think it will suffice to say that he's quite decorated. Above all, he has served as a superlative professor, a nationally recognized author, and an expert on the American presidency, an incredible advisor, and an iconic member of the university. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to give you our beloved Dr. Robert DiClerico.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Gretchen said a few minutes ago that speakers for this series have come from all around the world and from the backyard. This is a real backyarder tonight, I will tell you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here this evening. I'm deeply appreciative. The French statesman Pierre Mendès France once observed that to govern is to choose. That, of course, is why we put presidents in office, to choose. And it is by the choices they make that the more reflective eye of history will judge them. This evening, I would like to address a choice made by our 43rd president. A fitting time to revisit that choice, I think, as we marked just 2 weeks ago the 9th anniversary of our entry into the war in Iraq. As we look back on the choices George W. Bush made as president, going to war with Iraq was the most crucial decision of his presidency. It was arguably also the most consequential foreign policy decision made by a president since the Vietnam War. The decision was and remains highly controversial. The president and his supporters argued that the war was well worth the price. Not only did we rid the world of a dictator who chronically abused his people, invaded his neighbors, and conspired with terrorists, but we replaced him with a nascent democracy which may serve as a beachhead for democratic movements in other parts of the region. The critics, on the other hand, point out that the fundamental rationale for the invasion, that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction, proved false. And the price for that miscalculation was unacceptably high. There was first the human cost. Nearly 4,500 Americans killed, 32,000 wounded, along with 700,000 Iraqi civilians and military deaths. There were also the financial costs. As calculated by a Nobel laureate in economics, when the indirect are factored in with the direct cost, the price tag for the war will approach $3 trillion. Add to these human and financial costs the fact that the invasion of Iraq and subsequent efforts to pacify the country diverted crucial resources from the ongoing war in Afghanistan, thereby greatly extending its length and making it the longest war in American history, with a price to date of 2,000 American lives and $500 billion. Add further that the war was undertaken without the imprimatur of the UN, thereby seriously damaging our standing in the world. And finally, it has been pointed out that abhorrent though Saddam Hussein was, he nevertheless served a useful purpose by keeping Iran in check, a country that is a much greater threat to stability in the Middle East and with which the current Iraqi government, ironically, now enjoys a cordial relationship. We have a right to expect that before a president makes a decision of great moment, he will have turned over every rock, scoured every option. That means reaching out to as many sources of information and advice as possible, challenging his advisors, inviting them to challenge each other, and most importantly, to question him. This last consideration is one of the greatest challenges any organization confronts. That is to say, creating a decision-making culture in which those around the leader feel free to tell him or her what they may not want to hear. This problem is particularly acute in the presidency, an office which, by virtue of its power and mystique, can have an intimidating effect on others. A 60 Minutes interview conducted by Katie Couric with Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's first chief of staff, is illuminating in this regard. Hard driving with a reputation for making his views known to those around him in blunt and sometimes florid language, his brashness apparently wilted when in the presence of President Obama. Couric asked him, "Have you ever said to the president, 'I think you're wrong'?" To which Emanuel responded, "No, not in those words." Or consider President Reagan's White House Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, a former Marine colonel and a one-time CEO of what was at that time the largest brokerage firm in the country. Scarcely viewed as a shrinking violet in the Washington community. In fact, he was so abrasive that the president ultimately had to let him go. Scarcely viewed as a shrinking violet in the Washington community, in his memoirs he sought to explain why he had failed to challenge the president when he thought Reagan had made an important decision too quickly, without having had it properly staffed out. He said, "It is one thing to brashly speak your mind to an ordinary mortal, and quite another to say, 'Wait a minute,' to the President of the United States. The mystery of the office is a potent inhibitor." With all of this in mind, let me turn more directly to the matter of the decision to go to war with Iraq. In recalling the deliberations on this matter, former President George W. Bush observed in his book Decision Points, and I quote, "For months I had solicited advice, listened to a variety of opinions, and considered the counter-arguments. Given everything we knew, allowing Saddam to remain in power would have amounted to an enormous gamble. After seeing the horror of 9/11, that was a chance I was not willing to take. In what follows, I would like to suggest that the disposition of key Bush advisors, the management of the national security process, and the President's own approach to decision-making all conspired against the careful deliberation of the issue implied in the President's statement. In an address to the graduating class at West Point in June of 2002, President Bush laid out in some detail the rationale for invading Iraq, arguing that Saddam could give his WMDs to terrorists. They would then attack the United States as they had repeatedly vowed to do, and we might never learn who was responsible for supplying them with those weapons. Thus, the only way to forestall such an eventuality would be to eliminate the source of WMDs before they posed a threat. Presumably then, prior to launching an attack against Iraq, the President would have to know with some degree of certainty whether Saddam Hussein in fact possessed WMDs, and if so, whether there was any evidence to suggest a connection between him and al-Qaeda. In seeking answers to these questions, the role of intelligence agencies would, of course, be crucial. As to the connection between Saddam and al-Qaeda, Bush administration officials left little doubt. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld in December of 2002 asserted that the evidence on the link between the two is, quote, bulletproof, unquote, while Vice President Cheney characterized it as, quote, overwhelming, unquote. The President's National Security Advisor also weighed in, stating, and I quote, there are clearly contacts between al-Qaeda and Iraq that can be documented. The President, meanwhile, maintained that in the fight against terror, al-Qaeda and Saddam were indistinguishable, and on another occasion in October of 2002 informed Americans that the Iraqi dictator was training al-Qaeda forces in bomb-making and poisons and deadly gases. These bold assertions were based upon evidence that was highly suspect. The first was an alleged meeting between 9/11 hijacker Mohammed Atta and an Iraqi intelligence officer in Prague in 2001. Neither the FBI nor the CIA found any evidence for either. Indeed, the President's daily national security brief some 5 months later, on September 21st, stated that the CIA concluded there was no connection between Saddam and al-Qaeda. And yet, as I just told you, the President in October told us that Saddam was training al-Qaeda forces in bomb-making, poisons, and deadly gases. Allegedly, there were also meetings between members of al-Qaeda and Iraqi officials in the 1990s. Based upon their examination of the evidence, however, the 9/11 Commission concluded that while some meetings may have transpired, and I quote, we have seen no evidence that these or earlier contacts ever developed into a collaborative operational relationship, nor have we seen evidence indicating that Iraq cooperated with al-Qaeda in developing or carrying out any attacks against the United States. The administration also pointed to the confessions of a senior al-Qaeda figure, Sheikh al-Libi, captured in Pakistan, who reported that his organization was receiving training by Iraqis in the use of WMDs, a claim given little credence by the Defense Intelligence Agency, in which al-Libi himself would later recant. In sum, with respect to the possible link between Saddam and al-Qaeda, Paul Pillar, who was responsible for coordinating intelligence on Iraq within the government, stated, and I quote, the greatest discrepancy between the administration's public statements and the intelligence community's judgments concern the relationship between Saddam and al-Qaeda. The enormous attention devoted to this subject did not reflect any judgment by intelligence officials that there was or was likely to be anything like the alliance the administration said existed. Deeply frustrated by what was perceived to be the CIA's failure to aggressively follow potential connections between Saddam and al-Qaeda, the Defense Department began using its Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group to pursue its own leads. Created after 9/11 and headed by Under Secretary of Defense Douglas Feith, The group collected information from its own sources and forwarded it directly to White House officials without having received any vetting by any other units within the intelligence community. Although sympathetically received by the Vice President and others, much of it proved to be unreliable. Indeed, an investigation conducted by the Pentagon's Inspector General concluded that the intelligence provided by the Counterterrorism Evaluation Group was, and I quote, of dubious quality and reliability. What of the evidence that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction? The CIA prepared a crucially important 90-page national intelligence estimate for Congress and the administration on this question in October of 2002, titled Iraq's Continuing Program for Weapons of Mass Destruction. Such an exercise normally takes 6 months to prepare, with sources being rechecked and findings subject to lengthy discussions. This one was prepared in 3 weeks. In a later report issued by the Senate Intelligence Committee, a 511-page report, by the way, it found serious defects in the intelligence estimate, including overstatement of the evidence, reliance on dubious sources, rejection of evidence that did not fit their own assumptions, and the downplaying of dissenting analysis. Thus, the agency relied on an Iraqi defector held by Germans named Curveball, who claimed that Saddam possessed chemical and biological weapons. This despite the fact that Germans said they could not verify his claims and had little confidence in him, with one German intelligence officer describing him as a crazy man. Their skepticism was apparently well-founded, for in a 60 Minutes interview just this past year, Curveball acknowledged that his claims were completely false and stated as well that he had never even been interviewed by an American official. What of the National Intelligence Estimate's assessment of Saddam's efforts to develop nuclear weapons? Clearly the matter of greatest potential concern to our government. It included a finding that Saddam had sought natural uranium in Niger. The State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research judged these claims to be highly dubious. Yet the President included a reference to it in his 2003 State of the Union address, despite the fact that a CIA official had advised taking it out. A member of the President's National Security Council staff refused to remove the claim, but put in a statement instead saying this information came from British intelligence sources rather than American. CIA Director Tenet would later acknowledge that administration claims about Iraq developing nuclear weapons were, and I quote, went well beyond what our analysis could support. But there's no evidence in the record that the CIA director ever said to the President, wait a minute. Further evidence to support Saddam's nuclear weapons program came in a 2001 CIA report stating that he was trying to purchase several thousand aluminum tubes that could be used to enrich uranium for a nuclear bomb. The source of this conclusion was a former worker at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. This evidence, too, made its way into the 2002 National Intelligence Estimate with the qualification that some dissented from this assessment. These dissents, however, were attached at the end of a 91-page document. They came from the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, as well as top experts in the U.S. Department of Energy, all of whom argued that the tubes were for conventional use, a view shared, incidentally, by their counterparts in England. The National Intelligence Estimate was followed shortly by a white paper on Iraq's WMDs prepared by the CIA at the request of the White House and released in October of 2002 during the height of the midterm congressional elections and just as Congress was debating whether to authorize war against Iraq. None of these dissents I just mentioned was included. Instead, the report asserted that all experts agreed Iraq was pursuing nuclear weapons. The aluminum tubes were cited by administration officials as conclusive proof of Saddam's intentions, including by the President in his 2003 State of the Union address, and even by Secretary of State Colin Powell in his speech to the UN Security Council in February of 2003. even though the Secretary's own intelligence division within the State Department strongly disagreed. If the CIA seemed heavily disposed towards making a case for the existence of weapons of mass destruction, it is worth considering why. As the CIA acquired and analyzed intelligence, key advisors to the president let it be known that evidence for WMDs would be more favorably received. That they would have taken this posture is not altogether surprising, for several had long harbored a deep antipathy towards Saddam. Indeed, as far back as 1997, a letter was sent to President Clinton urging war against Iraq. The signees included individuals who would occupy important national security positions in the Bush administration. Donald Rumsfeld, who would become Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Richard Pearl, Chairman of the Defense Policy Board. 4 years later, as President Bush pondered how to respond to the 9/11 attack, it was Rumsfeld who in 2 separate meetings urged the president to attack and on another occasion reiterated his preference for attacking Iraq because Afghanistan had no easy targets, but Iraq did. This despite the fact that there was no ostensible evidence that Saddam had anything to do with the attack on 9/11. Rumsfeld's deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, who saw Iraq as the greatest threat, weighed in as well, urging the president to go after Iraq as well as Afghanistan, believing that taking down the Iraqi dictator was not only necessary but easily achievable. More than a year later, when the administration was considering whether to attack Iraq, the powerful voice of the vice president would be added to these others, with journalist Bob Wood recording that Secretary of State Colin Powell detected in the vice president, and I quote, a kind of fever. The vice president was hell-bent for action against Saddam. It was as if nothing else existed. The effort to apply pressure on the intelligence community included visits by the vice president, the most powerful vice president in American history, visits by Vice President to CIA headquarters on 12 different occasions in 2002, during which he vigorously probed how the agency was handling the collection of information on Iraq. In addition, if the intelligence forwarded to the White House raised questions about the case for WMDs, intelligence analysts were asked to check again and redo the analysis. Indeed, in the 511-page report of the Senate Intelligence Committee, they quote the CIA Director George Tenet as confirming that some agency officials raised with him personally the matter of repetitive tasking and the pressure that it created during this period. Apparently, agency patience with the use of this tactic was not unlimited, however. After repeatedly being asked by the Office of the Vice President's Chief of Staff to revise a report questioning the link between Saddam and al-Qaeda, CIA Director took the phone, put his foot down 4 times using a 4-letter word that is liberally sprinkled through many a student conversation on this campus, I might add, telling the Vice President's office to back off. If some administration officials attempted to influence the direction of intelligence on Iraq, did it have the intended effect? The way the National Intelligence Estimate was framed would seem to suggest it did. I should note, however, that according to a report of the Bipartisan Commission on Intelligence Activities and Weapons of Mass Destruction, I've cut down on the formal name of that or we'll be here all night. Intelligence Activities and Weapons of Mass Destruction, this is what they say. The analysts who worked the Iraqi weapons issues universally agreed that in no instance did political pressure cause them to skew or alter any of their analytical judgments, end of quote. There are grounds, however, for viewing these claims with considerable skepticism. Paul Pillar, Princeton grad, Oxford graduate, a 28-year veteran with the CIA and responsible for coordinating assessments on Iraq from all 15 intelligence agencies within the government, insists that the politicization of intelligence did in fact occur. It was, he suggested, a subtle process in which the White House influenced the agency by posing questions that pushed the process in the direction of finding evidence that supported the case for war. These efforts, along with public statements of administration officials, caused analysts to conclude that the administration was in favor of the war option and now I quote from Paul Pillar, would frown on or ignore analysis that called into question a decision to go to war and welcome analysis that supported that decision. They felt a strong wind consistently blowing in one direction. The desire to bend with such a wind is natural and strong, even if unconscious. End of quote. Pillar acknowledged that he, too, fell victim to this desire. When the White House, as I noted earlier, asked the CIA to prepare a white paper on Iraq's weapons, it was Pillar who was given the responsibility for putting it together. Released by the White House just as Congress began debating whether to give President Bush the authority to wage war against Iraq, this document contained none of the dissents registered by various officials in the government. Pillar acknowledged that, and I quote, in retrospect, we shouldn't have done that white paper at all. It wasn't really intelligence. The white paper was policy advocacy. One of the biggest regrets of my career is that I didn't find a way to say no. End of quote. Thus far, it has been suggested that key advisors around the president were heavily disposed to going to war with Iraq and that they attempted to shape the intelligence to that end, with apparent success. But what of the approach taken by President Bush in weighing of information and advice leading up to his fateful decision to invade Iraq? By inclination, the president was not disposed to probe deeply into issues, did not enjoy long conversations or reading lengthy briefing papers. David Kay, the highly regarded American weapons inspector for the UN and International Atomic Energy Agency, and he had no axe to grind in this, noted, for example, and I quote, "I'm not sure I've spoken to anyone at that level who seemed less inquisitive." Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense under both Presidents Bush and Obama, when asked to compare the two, said Obama is more analytical than Bush and left it at that. Others have described his leadership style as hurried. George W. Bush himself characterized his approach to decisions as that of a gut player, relying, he said, on my instincts. Nor apparently did his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, who was in charge of organizing the national security process, do much to compensate for the president's more informal approach by forcing a more systematic consideration of the issues and an airing of differences in the presence of the president. According to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, meetings were not well organized, and Rice sought to paper over differences among the president's advisors rather than confronting them. I quote, "The bridging approach Rice favored did not take advantage of the president's demonstrated willingness to engage in candid, open, and fair hearing of views." End of quote. Richard Haas, the current president of the Council on Foreign Relations and director of policy planning at the State Department during the Bush administration, writes that the president, quote, "paid a price for the informality of presidential decision-making during much of his administration." Nor was Secretary of State Colin Powell silent on the subject, noting that Rice had a tendency to tell the president what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to hear. The national security process, he said, was broken. Rice was the source of the problem, and unless it functioned properly, the president could not know what he needs to know when he needs to know it. Although Rice says she saw her job as raising red flags and getting the president to rethink things, Richard Haas's account of his time in the Bush administration would appear to raise some doubts about how effectively she performed that role. He recalls that in July of 2002, we went to war with Iraq in March 2003. He recalls that in July of 2002, he met with Condoleezza Rice, his close friend, and warned her against going to war with Iraq, arguing that it would overshadow foreign policy, be difficult to achieve, and produce few tangible benefits. I quote now from Haas, "She brushed away my concerns, saying the president had made up his mind. I emerged from our meeting quite taken aback by the way Condi had shut down conversation on Iraq." This statement by Rice in July, it should be noted, came more than 8 months before the CIA's national intelligence estimate had been prepared and 8 months before the United States would invade Iraq. It was also during that July, incidentally, when British Prime Minister Tony Blair's diplomatic advisor informed his boss that the attitude in Washington had changed and that Bush wanted to remove Saddam by force. While Rice's management of national security process may have left much to be desired, in the final analysis, it is the president who drives that process. He has to be responsible for maximizing the flow of information and advice into the Oval Office, of getting into his head the things he needs to get into his head. On this score, it is difficult to conclude that President Bush exercised due diligence. After the abortive invasion at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, a dispirited and very depressed President Kennedy called Dwight Eisenhower on the phone and said, "Could you come over and could we talk?" And Eisenhower came over to the White House, and Kennedy explained to him how he had gone about making the decision to invade Cuba. And after he was done, Eisenhower looked at him and said, "You have to make them argue it out in front of you. Make them argue it out in front of you." There is no evidence to suggest that this happened here. For example, on the hugely important issue of whether Saddam was developing nuclear weapons, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice has said that the president was never informed of dissenting views within the intelligence community on this question. We now know, however, that the president was in fact told on more than one occasion that officials in both the State Department, Energy Department, and even some analysts within the CIA itself had serious doubts about the claim that Saddam was developing nuclear weapons. In light of this disagreement on such a crucial question, why did the president not call the appropriate parties to the White House to argue their differences out in front of him? On another occasion, in December of 2002, both CI Director Tenet and his deputy made an elaborate Oval Office presentation to the president on the case for WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. The purpose of this meeting was not to debate the issue, but to lay out how the case would be made to the public. At the conclusion of this meeting, an unimpressed president said, "Nice try. I don't think this is not something that Joe Public would understand or would gain confidence from. I've been told all this intelligence about having WMDs, and this is the best we've got?" Director Tenet blurted out, "It's a slam dunk." The president persisted, "George, how confident are you?" The director reiterated, "Don't worry, it's a slam dunk." Despite the president's apparent concern here, there is nothing in the record to suggest that he demanded that the evidence be laid out before him in a subsequent meeting. Finally, it's worth noting here that the president in his book said that he did not need to ask his key advisors whether they favored going to war because, and I quote, "I knew where all of my advisors stood," unquote. But consider that in his book, Bush's War, in which Bob Woodward chronicles the deliberations leading up the decision to go to war against Afghanistan back in 2001, Woodward records the president as expressing concern, and I quote, that around the table were advisors Powell, Cheney, and Wolfowitz, who had been with his father during the Gulf War against Iraq, and that one of the things he wasn't going to allow to happen was to let them use the war on terror as an excuse to settle an old score, namely that they hadn't gone to Baghdad and captured Saddam during the first Iraqi war. Given the president's skepticism about their objectivity on Iraq, why then didn't he force them to defend their views now in a forum where they could be challenged and tested against skeptics such as Powell, Armitage, and Hart? Yet no such meetings ever took place. Listen to Secretary of State Powell. There was no moment when we all made our recommendations and Bush made a decision. Richard Haas, Director of Policy Planning, the Bush administration at the State Department. There was no meeting or set of meetings at which the pros and cons were debated and a formal decision taken. And listen to George Tenet, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. There was never a serious debate that I know of within the administration about the imminence of the Iraqi threat. In none of the meetings can anyone remember a discussion of the central questions: was it wise to go to war? Was it the right thing to do? All actions focused instead on planning. Finally, I noted earlier that there is a strong tendency among those around the president to tell him what he wants to hear, once it becomes clear what that is. In this case, the president did not play his cards close to his vest, but rather sent clear signals as to his predispositions. On 3 occasions, he approached the White House czar on security and terrorism, asking him to check again on any Iraqi connection to terrorism directed at the United States. Then there were, of course, the 12 visits by the vice president to the CIA, visits that no one in the agency or the government would see as taking place without the approval of the president. There were also repeated queries by members of the National Security Council staff and the vice president's staff to reanalyze the evidence. The point got made. One CIA manager convened a meeting of 50 workers telling them, and I quote, "If the president wants to go to war, ladies and gentlemen, your job's to give him a reason to do so." End of quote. The White House Commission on Weapons of Mass Destruction notes that the president's daily national security brief, prepared by the CIA and delivered each morning to the president, was even more misleading than the national intelligence estimate. The daily briefs, they said, contained more alarmist statements, a repetition of those statements leaving a false impression that there were many more confirming reports than in fact there were, and a failure to include in later daily briefs information that called into question material presented in earlier briefs. In the opinion of the commission, all of this was designed, and I quote, "to keep the first customer interested," unquote. Not everybody got the message, however. Thus, when Bruce Hardcastle, a defense intelligence officer for the Middle East, South Asia, and terrorism, informed Bush officials, and I quote, they were misreading the evidence, he was removed and his position was abolished. According to the former head of human intelligence at the CIA, and I quote, they didn't want a senior intelligence person who argued with them. By way of concluding, it is hard to conjure up a set of circumstances less conducive to flushing out the facts, thoroughly airing how they should be interpreted, and what potential courses of action should follow from those interpretations. We had a Secretary of State who had serious doubts about the war and whose own intelligence division raised serious questions about many key pieces of evidence, but yet he did not insist that the president confronts those questions. A vice president and secretary of defense so convinced of the correctness of their positions that they used the defense intelligence bureaucracies to generate material that confirmed them, while discouraging analyses that did not. A CIA director who was content to remain silent when the White House strayed far from the shores of the evidence his agency had provided, and who at other times was more than willing to tell the president what he wanted to hear. And finally, a national security advisor who did not shape the national security process in such a way that the president would be forced to confront a rigorous testing of his own predispositions on this question. There have been various proposals over the years, including from such eminences as the scholar diplomat George Kennan, calling for the creation of one or another group, all with the purpose of trying to save presidents from themselves. But these, I'm afraid, rest more in hope than reality, for in the final analysis, presidents make decisions as they wish to make them. In this particular case, the president's advisors served him poorly, to be sure, but they did so because he wanted them to. 2 months after his mission-accomplished speech aboard the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, President Bush spoke before the annual radio and television correspondents' dinner in Washington. When presidents appear at this or other such dinners with the press, they are expected to give light-hearted presentations. President Bush did not disappoint, delivering one line after another with impeccable timing. At one point, however, the lights dimmed, and a big video screen appeared behind him showing the Oval Office, with voices saying, "Those weapons of mass destruction have to be somewhere. Maybe under here." Nope. No weapons there. But what about over there? Nope, none there. And there on the video screen were the president and the vice president scouring the Oval Office for WMDs, looking behind drapes, under the desk, at one point on their knees looking under the furniture, all done with the greatest of care. Would that the president had exercised that same degree of care in deciding whether to take us into war against Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. DiClerico. We are now happy to take your questions. If anyone has a question for Professor DiClerico, please feel free to come forward to one of the two microphones. Thank you.
It seems to be the trouble with the president's decision, even though you stated towards the end that it's ultimately his decision and he'll make it how he feels. There needs to be more debate and dissidence within his cabinet. Would you be in favor of maybe a requirement to elect people that are passionate dissidents of the president, or maybe on the other side, towards his cabinet so that there is more room for argument?
Do you mean you'd be electing members to the president's cabinet?
Yeah, well, or electing or just appointing members for his cabinet so that at least there's someone from the other side saying, well, I don't like this because.
Well, I don't think there's any way that selecting people to the cabinet who don't have the approval and sympathy of the president, I don't think there's any way that would work. He would simply organize them out of the process.
Right.
I think and this has been proposed, and I think, and the problem with all of these groups that George Kennan and others are arguing should be created that a president can turn to on foreign policy issues is there isn't anything that requires the president to consult these groups. And it may be that once you institutionalize them, I mean, some of these proposals call for their being nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. Once you institutionalize them, that may scare off the president even more. Probably far more effective for the president simply to bring in on an informal basis groups of people whom he respects a great deal, who I think would have a far greater potential impact on him. Lyndon Johnson did this during the Vietnam War, when Robert McNamara left the administration because he couldn't tolerate the war anymore and was replaced by Clark Clifford, Lyndon Johnson's very close friend. Clifford spent several months going through the bureaucracy and ultimately concluded that the war was a losing proposition, said, I've got to get the president to see this. And he went to Lyndon Johnson and said, will you allow me to bring to D.C. a group of your friends whom you respect greatly and let them go through the bureaucracy for a week and come back and give you their assessment? And Johnson resisted and said, no, we've just completely reevaluated the war effort, and all of my advisors tell me that we should stay the course. Of course, they all told him that because that's what he wanted them to tell him. Finally, Clifford prevailed upon him. And so Johnson brought former ambassadors, retired generals, retired lawyers, all old friends of his to D.C., where for 1 week they were briefed by the CIA, Defense Department, and State Department without Johnson being present in the room. And at the end of the week, they convened in the cabinet. They were given the nickname the Wise Men. They convened in the president's cabinet, and the president said, what's your conclusion? And the chair of the group said, Mr. President, we're losing the war, and you should hand over responsibility to the South Vietnamese as quickly as you possibly can. And Johnson turned to his left to Clark Clifford, who had organized this, and said, who poisoned the well? And Clifford said, well, I didn't, Mr. President. Johnson said a second time, who poisoned the well? A third time, tell me who poisoned the well. There is no way all of these people could have reached this conclusion if the people who were briefing them told them what they've been telling me. And of course, they weren't. It virtually destroyed his relationship with Clark Clifford, but it caused Johnson to go on national television and announce to the world that we would suspend the bombing of North Vietnam and discuss the possibility of negotiations. That's what that outside group of wise men, not in any way tied to the administration, that's the kind of an impact they were able to have. Were you to institutionalize the group, my guess is they probably would not be as effective. What I had started to say was, and I don't think, as I say, I don't think there's any way that cabinet members, if they haven't been appointed by the president, are going to be of very great use to him. He simply will organize them out of the process. John McCain said if he were president, and John Glenn said if he were president, Richard Gephardt said if he were president, that he would be willing to go before the Congress of the United States and answer questions in the well of the House. And that, I think, has some possibilities. Some reality testing for the President of the United States where he would be forced to hear from his peers things that he might not necessarily want to hear.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Clare.
Thank you. To the right here.
Could I be off topic for a moment?
Uh-huh.
Years ago, on the first day of your American presidency class, you said that we were going to have a discussion because it would be the height of arrogance were you to think that you didn't have anything to learn from us. Of course, after that, I went to law school where I was never told that by any professor. My question is, what did you learn over all those years?
Well, in some instances, students have said things that flat out I didn't know, okay, that of a factual nature. More often, it's students posing questions to you that start you thinking in your own mind about something that takes you to a place in your thinking that you've never been before. I mean, I can recall a student saying, I'm not saying that I agreed with him, but saying, and when it's something I just hadn't thought about. And he had said, why is it that you choose to regulate money in campaigns? I'm going to grow up, I want to be a doctor. I'm not going to have time to devote to a campaign, so I'll be able to support a candidate through money. You're a college professor, you're not making much money, but you've got plenty of time in your hands, okay? So you can devote all of that time to assisting a candidate. You're regulating the contribution I can make to a candidate, but you're not regulating the time that DiClerico is going to give to a candidate. How do you justify that? I know, gee, that's a pretty good question. And I hadn't thought about it before. As I say, ultimately I don't agree with it, but it started me thinking. Yeah.
Thank you. To the left here.
Yes. I want to begin by thanking you for your lecture. I want to say the obvious to all who are in attendance. Professor DiClerico has not simply illuminated the vexing question of the nature of the chief executive's position in our democracy. He has also presented us this evening with an exquisite demonstration of close, critical thinking about a subject of great complexity and of great importance, in which he was more than willing, I'm sure, with some degree of misgivings, to contemplate the opinions of those with whom he obviously strongly disagrees, and to present their viewpoints in tandem with his larger argument. This is the epitome of academic thought at its greatest. And I want everybody in the room to consider not only what he said and the conclusions he drew, but the shape and structure of the argument with which he presented them. These are the sorts of thinking that epitomize the greatness of academic work in this institution and in academia everywhere in the world.
Thank you. Very much.
What I want to observe also, parenthetically, is that Professor DiClerico and I share but one thing in common, but it has proven to be extremely important to the both of us. We are both proud alumni of the same college in central New York State, the college on the hilltop whose days will never end, and that is Hamilton College. But what I wish to ask you, sir, is this. Is the problem of the presidency endemic to the office, or is it a function of the personalities that attain the office?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm afraid it's endemic to the office. I have a whole list of quotes. Let me just read you. Let me just read you just one here. Gerald Ford was not an intimidating personality. Donald Rumsfeld, who was Gerald Ford's chief of staff. I can think of many instances where individuals who have been longtime associates and colleagues of the president's have been in a meeting with the president, addressed an issue with him, and then slipped down to my office after the meeting and said, now what I really wanted to say to the president was this, would you please tell him? So I think it's endemic to the office. But obviously, it becomes even more acute when you have somebody in the office who is enormously insecure and a very imposing personality, such as a Lyndon Johnson. I think the problem was particularly acute with Johnson, who became, I think, because of his own insecurities, so intoxicated by the presidency that he thought, as president, he ought not to be disagreed with. There's one occasion when, towards the end of Johnson's presidency, when he couldn't speak anywhere except on a military base without being hooted down by crowds, and he had just given a speech on one military base and was headed back out towards the plane, and a young lieutenant came up to him and said, excuse me, President Johnson, sir, but your plane isn't here, it's over here. And Johnson stopped dead in his tracks and took this young lieutenant, Johnson was a towering figure, took this young lieutenant by the shirt and brought him up on his toes and said, son, let me tell you something so you never, ever forget it. You see all those planes over there and all of those helicopters over there? They're all mine. Okay? And this is someone who had the presidential seal on his boots, on his belt bucket, on his toothbrushes, talked about my Supreme Court, my Congress. I think it's endemic to the presidency, and it becomes more acute with personalities that are particularly susceptible to the trappings of the office.
Thank you. To the right here.
I was just wondering, I think it was around the 1980s, there was a book written called The Wizards of Armageddon, and it talked about how in the Johnson administration, how the defense intellectuals had failed Johnson in Vietnam. And in particular, it talked about how the defense intellectuals had this idea that all that America had to do in Vietnam was provide a counterforce. And if you matched troops for troops, then they would surrender because we were better, and we would match force for force. And that was one of the things that led us into the terrible thing in Vietnam. And I was wondering what relationship that had to what the intellectuals were saying to Bush in this conflict, in particularly where they believe this belief in the democratic peace, this belief that if you have these democracies and you start to change this culture, and there's democracies over there, and there's things happening now in Libya, and if you can transform the culture so that they're voting, that this somehow would be in America's strategic interest. And I'm wondering what you thought about the relationship of the democratic peace to the war, and if we look 100 years from now and we see culturally that there's voting over there. Is that something that would make history change its verdict about whether or not it was something
Well,
that's worthwhile?
I think that's a question more appropriately that should be directed to Dr. Peterson rather than to me. Let me just say that if you read Condoleezza Rice's book, Condoleezza Rice said, "We did not go to war to bring democracy to Iraq any more than we went to war with Germany to bring democracy to Germany." Okay? That was not, I mean, there's a kind of post hoc justification for the war, but that was not the justification for the war. Now, Bush people have argued, of course, that if you can establish a democracy in the Middle East, as I said, that it could serve as kind of a beachhead for democratic movements in other parts of the Middle East, perhaps, but the experiment in Iraq isn't going swimmingly at the moment. But there's been a 35% increase in civilian casualties since we left. He's taken the 56th Brigade and made it his own personal presidential guard and is using it now to harass his enemies. And Iraq was one of the major countries speaking out against imposing sanctions on Syria by the Arab League. So I don't think it's working particularly well at the moment, but those may be just growing pains. But the major point I wanted to make was that establishing a democracy there was not the primary motive for going to war with Iraq. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. To the left here.
Although the thrust of your talk focused almost entirely on the White House, there's one dimension that was not really considered, and that is the dissent that took place in the streets. As a professor of government, what's your take on the value and importance of extensive dissent in a democracy where it is viewed as patriotic?
Well, I have nothing but support for dissent, or even extensive dissent in a democracy. I mean, that's part of what we're all about. I think if anybody thinks that's an issue, I don't think they understand what democracy is all about. I think it's obviously it played a crucial and role in pressuring the government to bring an end to the Vietnam War. Had there not been mass demonstrations over a sustained period of time, I don't think the policy would have been changed.
Why do you suppose the dissent has almost dissipated concerning Iraq as well as Afghanistan?
Well, I think part of the reason that it is dissipated is that now, in essence, we have a professional army. The country doesn't go to war anymore. The military goes to war. In the old days, when everybody was drafted, practically everyone was suffering or knew a family who had suffered because of deaths or casualties in war. But once you did away with the draft and totally professionalized the Army, why, we all go about our daily business today without even thinking about it. Although, obviously, 5,000 died and 32,000, some terribly maimed, will suffer the rest of their lives. But I think that's the major reason. In fact, we're getting way off the subject. I would be in favor of going back to the draft for a variety of reasons. That's only one.
To the right here.
Professor DiClerico, first of all, as a proud alum of WVU, I'd like to absolutely thank you for being my very first class when I began my career at WVU, and my subsequent attending of law school and the classes I had with you. I can't thank you enough for the enlightenment that you gave me. So with that said, I'd like to ask you, can you think of a presidential decision, successful or unsuccessful for that matter, that comes close to the decision that President Bush faced that had such potential for backfire with the WMDs and the idea that what if they don't find them? You know, how does the presidency look? Can you think throughout the history of the presidency, can you think of another situation a president faced where it had such potential for backfire?
Well, I mean, there are lots of decisions that have the potential to backfire. I mean, D-Day could have backfired, okay? It didn't. But in the context of WMDs, no.
Okay. Thank you.
To the left here, please.
Hello, I'm a senior at WVU right now, and although I've never had one of your classes before, my father and all his friends have regaled me of tales of the great Dr. DiClerico when they were at WVU, and I think their interest in politics has definitely stemmed from you, and thus my interest in politics came from them as well, so I'd like to thank you for that. My question's a little bit of a two-parter. I guess your example you brought up of, I think for lack of a better term, groupthink in the Bush administration, is something that probably has examples of it in other American presidencies as well. Would you say that is more endemic of a Democratic presidency or Republican presidency, or is there no specific case?
I think it's groupthink does not discriminate by parties.
Also, thank you. One more question is. In your expertise, have you seen any instances of that in the Obama administration?
No. I have to say, from what I have seen of the Obama administration so far, I think he has been very careful to search out for information and advice and dissenting opinions. He chaired 9 meetings. Himself, 9 meetings before deciding to go with the surge in Afghanistan. Several months ago, he was meeting with a group, and they came in, and they sat down, and the group said, Mr. President, we unanimously agree this is the course of action we want to pursue, and he dismissed them. And he said, I want you to go back and bring to me the counter option to this one and argue it out here before me. He goes to great pains, and again, this is all being reported by insiders. We'll obviously have to wait for a more considered judgment till history's written. He goes to great pains in meetings to call on people who have not spoken, and to call on junior people, not just the people who are seated at the table, but the junior people who are sitting along the walls. Now, I think that's a very, very healthy thing.
Thank you very much.
We'll just finish with the folks that we have here. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Dr. DiClerico. I've never taken one of your classes before, but after that lecture, I really wish that I had. I'm a senior, military history major here, and I was wondering what your thoughts were about maybe not making it as much of a requirement, but maybe more of a heavy set, thought in people's minds to if presidents had military experience before they were elected. Would it be more useful in their judgments before going to war or coming back from one, or would it have no case at all for helping?
Well, it seems to me that it can never hurt. I don't think it's indispensable, but I think it would be a useful addition. I certainly wish there were more people serving in Congress at the moment who had had military experience, or who had sons and daughters who are in the military. I think they might think more carefully about authorizing more. I don't think Congress covered itself in glory in making the decision to authorize going to war in Iraq. They didn't declare war on Iraq. They turned over the authority to President Bush to start the war in Iraq. And I think that was unfortunate. I think in that way they avoided a lengthy debate on the subject, and I think if Congress has to declare war or otherwise authorize hostilities themselves, I think a much deeper and probing debate would take place.
Thank you so much.
Let's just finish out our last few questions and then we'll...
Okay, one more.
Okay, last one.
Dr. DiClerico, thank you for the enlightenment that I received from you, particularly at the time of the first Iraq War. I think, or would you think that some of the failure that happened in the case of the Bush administration is not really with the inner circle, but actually with the role of the opposition? To this day, I have on my wall a great speech that was given by a great senator from West Virginia, who was the only one that really raised his voice loudly in opposition to the war. Many others simply laughed at him in his own party. So wasn't this a failure of the opposition in this, instead of institutionalizing, having someone on the inside that speaks to the other side? Isn't this the role of the opposition, to be there raising loudly whatever reasons there may be to doubt the course of action that the president is taking?
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
You're absolutely right. And Senator Robert Byrd stood on the floor of the United States Senate and said, why this ominous silence rather than debating this question of whether we should go to war? Now is not the time for us to go to war. And I think you're right. I think the opposition did not meet its responsibilities. And it wasn't just the opposition. I think both parties did not adequately ventilate that issue and were too ready to rely on the white paper issued by the White House that was purified of dissenting positions. Most of them, when they read the national intelligence estimate, read the summary, they didn't read the details and the dissents. Senator Bob Graham of Florida did, but he was the notable exception. But I think the opposition failed. I think the Congress as a group failed.
Thank you very much, Dr. DiClerico. Thank you all very much for attending tonight. Greatly appreciate your time.